Hi there, today I'm going to be walking you through how you can create dynamic email content sections within your Marketo emails via API. And since you're interested in this advanced feature, I'm going to show you how you can streamline your entire email creation process using the Marketo API, Google Sheets, and Zapier. So to summarize what I'll show you in this video, we are going to show you how to send email content from a Google Sheet to Zapier, create a Marketo email program, the email asset, and smart campaigns, upload images from Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio using the API so that they can be used in your email. Then we're going to populate your email by transferring the content from the Google Sheet to the Marketo email using the Marketo API and Zapier. And then finally, we are going to create dynamic content sections within this email and populate these sections with the content from the Google Sheet using the API. So all the code I'll show you later on in this video, you can access with this directory here in GitHub. And if you need a refresher or it's your first time coming across the Marketo API, then check out the Marketo API Quick Start Guide blog post to show you how to make your first request using Postman. And if you're interested in implementing your own email creation workflow like I've outlined in this video, then take a look at lesson 4 of the Marketo API crash course, the Design Studio Upload and Newsletter Automation lesson, because this will walk you through how to make all the API requests I go through in this video in Postman, so you can fully understand what's going on before you try embedding these requests in an automation workflow. So I highly recommend checking out lesson 4 of the Marketo API crash course. Now, before diving into all this advanced automation, let's first of all cover what a segmentation is in Marketo, because this is the foundation for creating dynamic content within your Marketo emails. So a segmentation basically just lets you split your database into different categories. So I've got a segmentation set up here for telecommunications products, and then I've got 3 different segmentations and then the fallback default segmentation. So in here, you just define your smart list. So I just put in a very simple rule to say first name starts with B. For this CC one, I just said first name starts with A, and then you can guess with SMS, I just said first name starts with C. So you define your smart list criteria for each of these segmentations. And in the case that a person does not fall into any of these 3 segmentations that you've defined, they'll fall into the default segmentation here. So now your entire database will be split between these 4 segmentations, and you can use this segment within your emails in Marketo. So you can have content that is different for the CC audience, which is different than the content received by the SIP audience, which is different than the content received by the SMS audience. So that's the power of segmentation in Marketo. You can serve different email content to each of these different segments. And you can look at the Marketo docs here on segmentation if you need a refresher on how to set them up. Okay, now that we know what segmentations are in Marketo and how we can use them to change the content received by different people, I'm going to show you how you should set up your email template in order to make it as easy as possible to update via API. So if you want a good starting point, you can download this marketing newsletter template HTML file and then import it into your Marketo instance and create a new email template from this HTML file. So I'll show you a preview of what the email will look like once we create it from this template. So one thing to notice is that email variables are used throughout this email structure. So we can see we've got a feature image block, and then we've got different email variables defined here that let us change where the button links to, what image is used, or if we look at the feature block, we've got email variables for what the button text should be, what the button link should be, what the title should be, and what the text should be. And the advantage of using email variables is that it gives your email a very nice structure that makes it easy to update via API. So let's take a look at how we define these email variables within the email template. So you'll notice here that I've got different sections where I define all the email variables used within these different blocks. So you'll notice that I've got all the feature image variables defined here, all the feature block variables defined here, all the card variables defined here, and they all correspond to the variables that are used in these different sections within the email here. And when we take a look at the definition of these variables, so let's start with the title feature block and the text feature block. We can see that the default values are set to feature title and feature text. So when we first create an email from this email template, the email will be populated with those default values. So we can see here that the default values are pulled in. But once we update these email variables via API, these values will then be updated to the content we want. So this is why I really like using email variables for the structure, because as I'll show later on, you can set up a Google Sheet like this, where each of these sections of content map to different email variables. So then it's very easy to take this particular cell here, take whatever content is in it, and then push that into one of these email variables like the feature text block. Okay, so now let's cover the difference between local and global email variables in Marketo email templates. So you'll notice that for the vast majority of these email variables, you can see that this Marketo module scope is set equal to true. And that means that this variable will be a local variable, whereas at the top here, you can see that the module scope for this UTM variable is set equal to false. So when the module scope is set equal to false, that means it will be a global variable. And I'll show you now what the difference between the two is within the email itself. So I'll start with the global variable. So you can see that this UTM global variable that we defined here in the template, we set the module scope equal to false for this variable. So that's why it appears here in the global variable section as opposed to appearing underneath one of these other sections at the top. And where this global UTM variable is used, so let's do a search for this variable within the email template. So the way you invoke a variable within an email template is using the $, and then single curly brackets, and then the name of the variable. So let's go find next here to see where it's used. Searching within Marketo email templates is horrible, so bear with me here while I find this. Okay, so I found a good example here. So this sign-in link here has a link to sign in to the Telnex portal. And in the email template here, we can see we have the link to sign in, but then we append this link with the UTM variable here. So we have the $, single curly brackets, and then the name of the variable, and this will pull in that global UTM variable. And we append this global UTM variable to the end of every link in this email. So if I go Command F and I search for it again, find next. We can see that the link for one of the buttons, so we pull in the variable to get the link from the button, then we append the UTM parameter, and then we do the same thing again. We pull in the link for the button. So we'll define this variable here in the email. So for example, if it's the feature block, we'll put in the button link here. So this value is what will be pulled in to this variable. And then again, we append it with the global UTM variable. So this means that when we specify this global UTM variable here, and then in our email template, we use this global UTM variable after every single link in the email. So this link will have the UTM variable appended, this link, this link, this link, they'll all have the global UTM variable appended. So this is a great example of where to use global variables. You define it once over here, and then every single link within your email will have this global UTM variable appended. An example of where you use local variables instead is in these card sections. So within these card sections, you want each card to have a different title, different text, and a different link. So that's why even though at the top here, in the email, let's look at the card section. We've got one single card section where we define all the local variables. We can see the module scope is equal to true here. We define all the local variables used within these card sections. And then within the lower section of our template, we've got a card 1 defined, we've got a card 2 defined, and we've got a card 3 defined. And within each of these sections, they can all use the exact same local variables. And since the definition of these variables is local, these variables can have different values within each card section. So if we specify the card title here, we just say like Tyron test. We can change the card title here without affecting what the card title is in these other two cards. So similarly here, we can set this into Tyron test 2. So this is an example of where you use local variables, where you want to have repeated content, but have these variables have different values within each of those different pieces of content. The reason you wouldn't use a global variable here for these card sections is because if this card title was a global variable, if you set this equal to Tyron test, then all these other card titles would be Tyron text as well. So that would be a very bad example of a global variable, and that's why you want to use local variables for these different sections. So just to summarize, the reason we use email variables within Marketo emails is because it gives our emails a great structure. And then we can set up a Google Sheet like this, where we can map each of these sections of content to particular email variables and then update them very easily using the API. Okay, so let me explain how this Google Sheet is set up. If you want to access this Google Sheet, then head on over here to the blog post, and I'll put a link to this blog post in the description of the YouTube video. You can click this link here and it'll bring you to this Google Sheet template. And comparing each of these sections to this preview image, you can see how this corresponds to this title, this corresponds to here. We've got a CTA copy, which corresponds to the copy of this button. And then we've got these different items here. So this title responds to this title responds to this, and so on. So each of these three pieces at the top here corresponds to this. And then in the other news section down the bottom, this is where we're going to be pulling in the dynamic email content. So you'll see here, we've got an other news for our SMS segmentation, we've got other news for our SIP segmentation, and we've got other news for our call control segmentation. So that means that depending on what segment the person is in, they'll receive different other news section to people who are in different segments. One important thing to note is that when you're getting the Dropbox links for these images, it's very important that these links be in the correct format for the Dropbox API, because later on in this video, I'll show you how we're going to upload the images straight from Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio using the Dropbox and Marketo APIs. But in order to do that, we need these links to be in the correct format for the Dropbox API. So take a look at this video here, which will show you how to get the correct links to put in the Google Sheet. And now let's take a look at how we set up the backend side of this Google Sheet before we send all this information from the backend tab to Zapier. So this is where your content team will fill out all the content that will go in the newsletter and correspond to all these different email variables. Then in the backend tab, we just format it nicely. So you'll notice here that in each case, we've got the name of the module. So these module names correspond to, I just have to put my face somewhere for a second. These module names correspond to all these different modules here. So you'll see that we've got different card modules, we've got feature modules, we've got title modules, and like article modules. So if we go back to our template here, you'll see that we define the module ID. So we've got a feature image module ID, we've got the feature block, and we've got all the card module IDs. And then we specify the variable IDs. So we've got a card link, card source, card title, and card text. We've got these within each of our card modules. So if we open up a card module here, we've got the card link, card title, card text, and card source. So we are defining these for each of our card items here. And we do the same for the feature block, for example. We pull in all the variable IDs from the feature block. So just show you what that looks like. The feature block, we're pulling in these variables that we want to update via API, the text, the link, the title, and the other feature text. So we define the module ID and then the variable IDs within this module. And you'll notice here that the UTM global variable does not have a module ID. And the reason for this is because it's a global variable. This is a global variable, so it's not tied to a particular module. However, as I mentioned before, these four variables here, the card link, source, title, and text, are local variables. So that's why for these local variables, we have to define the module ID for these local variables. And since these variables are local to a module, these variables can have different values within these different modules. So that's why the UTM doesn't have a module ID, but all these local variables do have module IDs. And all these values here are pulled in from this first sheet using a VLOOKUP formula. And you'll notice if you look at this VLOOKUP formula, it uses another internal formula to pull in the latest month tab. So here at the top, we've just got a little formula that pulls in the current month. So if your content team comes in, all they have to do for the current month is duplicate this tab. So they can duplicate it, and then they create a new tab for September 2021. And then this backend tab would automatically update to pull in September 2021. And then all these VLOOKUP formulas would automatically update to pull the content from the new September 2021 sheet. So that's how automatic it is. Your team just has to come in, duplicate this sheet, populate the new sheet, and then all the values from the new sheet are transferred in here via the VLOOKUP formula and this date for the latest sheet. And you'll also notice here that we've got a Marketo link 1, link 2, link 3, and link 4 here. These are temporary placeholders, and later on, as I'll show you, these values will be replaced with the links to the images within the Marketo Design Studio. So you'll notice here that we've got a value that we want to change each of the variables to. But in this case, for these variables corresponding to images, we've also got a Dropbox column, and we put the Dropbox link in for each of these images. So later on, we're going to upload the image from the Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio using the API. And once we get the link for the Marketo image within the design studio, that's what this value will become, that's what this value will become, that's what this value will become, and that's what this value will become. And then we'll update all these email variables with all these values using the API to populate the email. Okay, so now that we have all our variables and the values we want to set these variables to set up and formatted very nicely in the backend tab here, we then need to figure out how to get this information from the backend tab into the submissions tab so that we can get it into Zapier. And the way we do this is by using a button that's tied to a Google script. So if we open up App Script here, we'll notice that we have a Google script defined, and you can get the code for this Google script by going to the submissions tab section here in the blog post, clicking on this link. It will bring you to this GitHub file, and then you can copy this code directly here into the Google Sheet script. And if you need an overview of what this JavaScript code does, how to attach this code to this button, and then how all these values then get taken into Zapier. If you want to understand this whole process, then you can take a look at the Zapier Google Sheets lookup value post, and it'll explain it all for you. But the overview is that this Google script gets attached to this button here, so that once the marketing operations team has reviewed that everything has been set up correctly here by the content team, they've got all the content in, they're using the correct Dropbox image links, then we can hit submit here. And then what this does is it takes all this information from the backend tab and it joins it together into 4 different columns. So a variable values, a subject line, Dropbox values, and dynamic values. It joins them all together into these 4 columns. And then when a new row is created in this submissions spreadsheet, this is what gets sent to Zapier to trigger the Zapier workflow to start our whole newsletter creation process. An important thing to note is that if you want to use emojis within the subject line of your email, is that you need to queue encode the emojis first before you hit this submit button. So in order to queue encode them, you can use this emoji queue encoder. So encode the emojis and then once they're ready to go. So if you want to use this emoji in the subject line, for example, you need to queue encode it first. Once you queue encode it, then you can hit the submit button here. And then, as I mentioned before, all this backend information gets formatted nicely and sent to Zapier so that the automation workflow can progress. Okay, so now let's jump into Zapier to see how this workflow is set up. So we use the Google Sheets app in Zapier and then the new or updated spreadsheet row event. And then here we just pull in the spreadsheet, we pull in the worksheet ID, and we pull in the trigger column. And in this case, we use column A, the timestamp column, as the trigger column. So this will pull in all 5 of these columns into Zapier. Then the first step is to get our Marketo access token so we can make subsequent API requests. And because the Marketo access token only lasts for 3,600 seconds, we need to check that the remaining token life on the current token is greater than 2 minutes long so that we have enough time to go through and make all these subsequent API requests. So we get the access token, we check to make sure that the life of the access token is greater than 2 minutes long. If it's not, then we wait until the life of the current token expires. Then we request a new token. And then once we have this new token, we proceed with the remaining steps. So then the first thing we do is we either get the parent ID or we create a new parent folder. So what I mean by this is, let me find the correct, here we are. So what we're finding in step number 3 here is we're either going to get the parent folder if it already exists, so it's newsletter 2023, or say we're in January 2024 and it's the first time this newsletter automations app has run, then it will need to create a new newsletter 2024 folder to house all the newsletters for the year 2024. But since we're in the middle of 2023, we already have the parent folder created. So instead of creating a new parent folder, we are just going to get the ID of this existing parent folder. And then in step 4, we are going to get last month's program by name. So since each of these programs follows a similar naming convention, it's very easy for us to know that if this month is April, we'll know that the name of last month's program would have been 2023-03 March newsletter. So we can get the ID of last month's program very easily using the API. So that's what we do here. We get last month's program using its name. Then we clone last month's program in step number 5. So we clone this program, and then we get this email 2023-04 April newsletter program. Even though step 5 returns the ID of this newly created program, I often found that Zapier didn't return the ID of the newly created program within 10 seconds. Zapier has a 10-second timeout limit on all its actions. So since this step didn't return the new program ID within 10 seconds, it would be marked as failed. And then all these other steps down below here that required this new program ID would fail because this step 5 would be marked as failed. However, I always found that even though this step was marked as failed, I could see that the new program was created in Marketo. It just wasn't given enough time to send the new program ID back over to Zapier. So I introduced a failsafe, which is step number 6 here. So in step number 5, we create the new newsletter or email program. And even if step 5 fails, it doesn't matter because step number 6 will look up the name of the program we created in step 5 to get the ID. So step number 6 here is a fail-safe. Step number 5 should return the program ID, but sometimes it times out before we can get that program ID. So that's why in step number 6, we just make doubly sure and we get the program ID of the newly created program in step 5. And then all these subsequent steps use the program ID from step number 6. Okay, so now that we have our program created via API, let's populate the email within that program with the content from the Google Sheet. So in step 7 here, we create a new email within this email program. So you might be wondering why we're creating a new email when the program we just cloned already has an email within it. The reason for this, and I explain this here within the blog post, is that when you use an email in an A/B test, it cannot be found with the Marketo API. So if we happened to use an A/B test in this email in March, and then we cloned this new email program for April, then this April email would also have an A/B test attached, and we wouldn't be able to find it or modify it using the API. So that's why in step number 7 here, we create a brand new email from our marketing newsletter template. And then later on, we can manually delete this initial email that was cloned over. Then in step number 8 here, we get the Dropbox links, which we can use to upload the Dropbox images straight to the Marketo Design Studio. If you want more information on how the Dropbox API works and how to upload from Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio using API, you can check out this blog post over here. So basically what step number 8 does is it takes these Dropbox links and gets temporary links that we will then use in step number 9, we take these temporary links we get from step 8 to upload the images straight from Dropbox to the Marketo Design Studio. And then in step number 10, once we have the links to the images in the Marketo Design Studio, these placeholder values are replaced with those links that we obtain from step 9. And then in step number 10, all these email variables are updated. So this is the first half of our email populated via API. So all these first sections here will now be populated with all these images and all this content. Now the remaining steps from step 11 here up to, so step 11 and step 12 here are what populate the dynamic email content sections here. So step number 11 here is what creates the dynamic email content sections. So if we go back to our email here, we'll notice that currently these other news sections here, there's no dynamic content associated with them. So step 11 turns both of these sections into dynamic content sections. And then step number 12 updates these dynamic email content sections with all the content for the different segments. So if we look at the backend tab where everything's formatted a bit nicer, all the SMS content from the Google Sheet will be taken and put into these two sections for the SMS segment. And then similarly, all this content for the SIP other news section will be taken and updated in our email in these two sections. So that's how a dynamic content section is created for these two sections. And then we take the content for each of those segments and we push them in here via API. And then we have a nicely formatted email. So we started with something like this, where we had all the default values of the email present when we first created the email. Then after running our automation, it takes all the values from the Google Sheet, pushes them into the email variables, and then it takes each of the pieces of content for the different segments and pushes them into the dynamic content sections at the bottom of the email. So that's how we can create and automate our entire email flow and populate dynamic email content using the Marketo API. And as I mentioned before, if it's your first time taking a look at the Marketo API, then I highly recommend taking a look at this Marketo API Quick Start Guide. And if you're really serious about automating your email creation process, I highly recommend checking out lesson 4 of the Marketo API crash course, because it walks you through how to make all the requests that I go through here in Zapier. It shows you how to make all these requests within Postman, so that once you fully understand what each of these requests is doing, you can then go about embedding these requests in an automation workflow like I've done in Zapier. So I hope you found this video tutorial useful. And as I said, I'll put the link to this blog post in the description of the YouTube video, so you can follow along and you can copy all the code I used in each of these Zapier steps by following these links. And then if you have any questions on any of this blog post, please let me know in either YouTube, or you can come in here and leave a comment on the blog post. Thank you. Have a great day.